The night was unusually still. Frost clung to the edges of shattered trees, and the distant hum of engines suggested nothing out of the ordinary. Soviet soldiers, entrenched deep in a remote forward base along the contested border, believed themselves safe, hidden under camouflage nets, with the roar of the artillery line kilometers away. Yet, unbeknownst to them, something unprecedented was approaching. Something that would turn routine vigilance into sheer terror. Sergei Ivanov, a seasoned T-72 commander, shifted uneasily in his hatch. His crew had spent weeks here, enduring the bitter cold, the constant threat of artillery, and the creeping dread that any misstep could cost them their lives. Still, nothing prepared them for the sight that would soon unfold above their heads. A faint blinking light appeared in the sky, moving too silently to be a helicopter, too small to be a jet. At first, it was dismissed as a meteor or a distant flare. But then came the second, third, and fourth. Lights moved with unnerving precision, hovering briefly before vanishing behind treetops. The soldiers squinted through night vision goggles, their breaths fogging inside helmets. "Drones," whispered a young private, barely audible over the crunch of snow beneath boots. His voice trembled. "Enemy drones. Up close." The realization hit like a lightning strike. These weren't reconnaissance drones. Not the clumsy, slow-moving ones the Soviets had tracked on intelligence reports. These were armed, highly mobile, autonomous, and terrifyingly accurate. Minutes later, the first explosion shattered the silence. A pinpoint strike obliterated a supply truck parked near the bunker perimeter. Metal twisted, fuel ignited, and flames licked the frozen earth. Panic spread instantly. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting orders and confusion in equal measure. Radios crackled with static, desperate messages to command. "We're under attack! Coordinates! Request immediate air support!" Sergei's T-72 rolled forward, its 125mm smoothbore gun trained skyward. They had seen many threats before, NATO air raids, artillery barrages, but this was something entirely different. The gun traversed furiously, trying to track a target that seemed to vanish into thin air, reappearing in seconds, launching small, deadly munitions that tore through bunkers, vehicles, and defensive positions with surgical precision. "Activate countermeasures!" Sergei bellowed. Smoke grenades hissed, erupting into dense clouds meant to hide positions. Anti-aircraft machine guns spat rounds into the sky, their tracers cutting arcs across the darkness. But each attempt to hit a drone was met with failure. They moved too fast, too unpredictable, like shadows dancing over the battlefield. Fear had already set in among the ranks. Meanwhile, artillery crews scrambled to respond. The base's older howitzers, set up for suppressive fire against conventional armored assaults, attempted to barrage the presumed launch sites. Shells tore through the forest, blowing apart trees and sending wildlife fleeing in panicked flocks. But the drones had already vanished beyond the line of fire. Every attempt to retaliate was met with strategic shock. These strikes were not only precise but anticipatory, as if the enemy had already foreseen each countermeasure. In the chaos, infantry squads were cut off. One unit, tasked with perimeter patrol, found itself ambushed as a drone dropped a small guided explosive on a forward trench. The explosion lifted men off their feet, covering the frozen mud with a veil of smoke, debris, and blood. Screams pierced the night, echoing across the snowy expanse. Confusion reigned. Soldiers fired blindly, trying to identify the unseen enemy. Panicked shouts of "Grenade!" and "Cover!" mingled with the whine of incoming drone munitions. The psychological impact was instantaneous. Fear spread faster than the explosions themselves. Veteran commanders stared at radar screens, their faces pale. Reports from the front lines confirmed the worst. Drones had breached the entire forward defense perimeter. Strategic shock enveloped the command. They were facing a weapons system that defied conventional doctrine. What they had assumed was a routine reconnaissance zone had turned into a killing field overnight. Overhead, the drones hovered silently. Their sensors glowed faintly, scanning, calculating, waiting for the perfect strike. Then came the devastation in rapid succession. Supply depots erupted, fuel trucks ignited, and T-72s that had been Sergei's pride were reduced to smoldering hulks. The soldiers were paralyzed, caught in a nightmare they had never trained for. By the time the first hint of dawn broke over the horizon, the base was unrecognizable. Smoke rose in jagged plumes, mingling with the morning mist. Survivors staggered through snow-stained trenches, trembling and disoriented. Radios were silent, supply lines cut, tanks destroyed or immobilized. The soldiers' minds raced to comprehend the magnitude of the attack. A night raid conducted by autonomous drones had shattered a fortified position without a single conventional aircraft crossing the front lines. Sergei Ivanov sat atop his battered T-72, surveying the ruins. Around him, the faces of his crew reflected the same mixture of disbelief and horror. The rules of engagement had changed overnight. The old doctrines of armor and artillery, once reliable, were obsolete in the face of this new terror. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, the enemy remained invisible, yet omnipresent, an unseen force capable of striking anywhere at any time. The stage had been set. Fear had taken root. The soldiers knew one thing with absolute certainty: survival now depended not on numbers or courage alone, but on adapting to a battlefield that had evolved in ways they could scarcely imagine. The nightmare was just beginning. The first light of dawn revealed the true scale of devastation. Twisted metal, blackened craters, and smoldering tank hulls littered the once proud Soviet base. But the threat had not ended with the night. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the enemy drones lingered, invisible yet omnipresent, their sensors scanning for movement, ready to strike again. Sergei Ivanov's squad was the first to regroup. His T-72, scarred but partially operational, rumbled forward across the frozen earth. His eyes scanned the horizon. Smoke spiraled from the north perimeter, where fuel trucks had exploded in a deadly chain reaction. The acrid smell of burning diesel mingled with the frost, choking men as they scrambled for position. Panic was palpable, yet discipline had to be enforced. Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov barked orders, his voice cracking over static-filled radios. "Reorganize! Form defensive lines! The drones have not left! Track, target, and fire!" But the battlefield had become a nightmare of unpredictability. Infantry squads moved into shallow trenches, their weapons trembling in cold hands. AK-74s cracked intermittently, bullets tearing into snowbanks or ricocheting off icy surfaces. Smoke grenades hissed as desperate measures to obscure positions, but the drones adapted instantly. Even through the haze, their laser-guided munitions found gaps in cover, punching through reinforced bunkers and piercing walls with deadly precision. Artillery crews scrambled to counterattack. A battery of D-30 howitzers fired in rapid succession, targeting areas where drone swarms had been detected. The ground shook as 122mm shells tore into frozen soil, sending trees splintering into the air. But with every detonation, it became clear the drones were operating with uncanny intelligence. They avoided blast zones, reappeared behind lines, and struck where resistance was weakest. Confusion spread among the artillery units. Even the most seasoned crews had never faced a weapon that could effectively nullify indirect fire. The first tank duel of the morning erupted near a collapsed ammo depot. A T-72 maneuvered cautiously toward an embankment when its commander spotted a faint glint in the sky, a drone descending rapidly, carrying a small explosive payload. The crew fired at it with the 12.7mm machine gun, tracers slicing the cold air, but the drone zigzagged with impossible agility. A sharp impact tore through the turret, setting fuel lines ablaze. The tank shuddered violently as crewmen were thrown against armor. Sergei shouted for retreat, the smell of burning metal and hydraulic fluid filling the cab. Panic gripped the men. What had once been a near-invincible vehicle now seemed fragile, exposed to invisible predators above. Meanwhile, infantry squads tried to organize counterattacks. Groups of soldiers flanked the tree line, throwing grenades into suspected drone positions and opening sustained fire. Yet every attempt was met with failure. Tiny, rapid explosions punctuated the cold air, cutting down squads before they could reach cover. Fear deepened into horror as men realized there was no safe zone. The drones could appear anywhere, strike anywhere, and vanish before a single shot landed. Soviet pilots in nearby airfields were scrambled, MiG-29s roaring into the sky in a desperate response. But even these aerial reinforcements met unexpected reversals. The drones, small and highly mobile, evaded radar lock-ons and heat-seeking missiles with terrifying efficiency. Pilots reported sudden bursts of electronic interference, instruments flickering and communications dropping in critical moments. What should have been air superiority turned into a disorienting nightmare. Pilots banked sharply, evasive maneuvers taking them into frigid clouds and snow-laden valleys, yet the drones remained elusive, striking with pinpoint accuracy. Commanders on the ground were forced into split-second decisions under extreme stress. Requests for air support, reinforcements, and tactical advice were met with radio silence or confusing coordinates. Some units attempted to form kill zones, relying on overlapping fields of fire to trap drones, but the enemy's strikes adapted faster than conventional planning allowed. The strategic shock was palpable. Protocols that had been drilled for years, tactics that had survived countless wars, suddenly failed against a weapon that defied convention. In one particularly harrowing incident, a platoon advancing toward an embankment found their path obliterated. A single drone had dropped a shaped charge explosive onto a fortified trench, creating a blast radius that wiped out half the platoon. Survivors scrambled for cover, their faces etched with disbelief and panic. Private Anatoly's voice broke as he cried out for his squad leader, only to realize the man had been thrown yards away by the blast. Horror hung in the air alongside acrid smoke, the battlefield now a terrifying theater of confusion and destruction. Artillery fire continued, but each volley seemed only to provoke more chaos. Trees fell across frozen roads, obscuring retreat routes. Tanks maneuvered cautiously, their crews constantly scanning the skies. Sergeant Dmitry Ivanovich, commanding a forward T-72 squadron, muttered under his breath, "We are fighting shadows, weapons that do not sleep, that do not hesitate. And they are learning faster than we can adapt." His words were not exaggeration. Every failed strike, every tactical misstep, became data for the drone's autonomous targeting systems. Meanwhile, the enemy maintained operational silence. There were no identifiable pilots, no bombers crossing the sky, no artillery barrages, only the whir of drone rotors, the occasional explosive impact, and the panicked cries of men caught in an invisible storm. Soldiers began to realize that traditional defenses, trenches, armor, counter-battery fire, were no longer sufficient. Every corner of the battlefield had become vulnerable. The fear was not just of death, but of impotence. The knowledge that no matter how hard they fought, they could not predict, intercept, or fully respond to the enemy. By mid-morning, the Soviets had lost the initiative. What had started as a forward defense outpost had devolved into a reactive, disorganized struggle. Commanders were forced to pull back, regroup, and reassess under extreme duress. The drones had set the rules, and the soldiers were scrambling to survive them. Strategic shock ran deeper than physical damage. Morale was cracking, and fear was now as lethal as any missile or shell. As smoke curled into the frigid sky and the sound of distant gunfire echoed through snow-covered hills, one truth became clear: this was no ordinary skirmish. It was a confrontation with a new form of warfare, one that combined technology, speed, and precision in a way that left conventional tactics obsolete. Panic was mounting. Confusion reigned. And the stage was set for escalation that would test every ounce of training, courage, and ingenuity the soldiers possessed. The battle had only just begun. The night had shown them the enemy's devastating power. The day would reveal whether Soviet strategy, discipline, and sheer human will could withstand it, or if they would crumble under a barrage of unseen terror. By late morning, the battlefield had become a hellish landscape. Snow-covered earth was churned into mud and craters, smoke and steam rising from twisted metal. The remnants of the Soviet forward base lay in ruin, yet the drones had not ceased their relentless assault. If anything, the precision and audacity of their attacks had intensified. What had started as a shocking raid had evolved into an all-out tactical nightmare, forcing soldiers to confront not just death, but the collapse of the doctrines they had trusted for decades. Sergei Ivanov's T-72 squadron moved cautiously along the frozen riverbed, using the frozen ice as a natural corridor. The tank's tracks grated against the icy surface, each rumble threatening to betray their position. The soldiers' breath came in white clouds, forming fleeting ghosts in the frigid air. Above them, drones hovered silently, surveying, calculating, waiting for a moment of vulnerability. The first salvo came without warning. A swarm of small quadrotor drones, each barely larger than a man's hand, descended with surgical precision. Tiny missiles tore through the air, detonating against the side armor of AT-72. Flames erupted from the fuel tanks as the vehicle shuddered violently. Crew members were thrown inside the turret, smoke and heat filling the compartment. The impact was catastrophic, a single strike rendering a battle-hardened tank useless within seconds. Horror struck the men. Their most trusted machines, designed to withstand heavy fire, were no match for these unseen killers. Infantry squads fanned out to cover open ground, AK-74s and RPKs scanning the sky for movement. One squad fired a concentrated barrage at a hovering drone, tracers cutting arcs through the cold morning air. But the drones adapted instantly. A small explosion behind the squad threw soldiers to the ground, and within seconds another strike tore through a supply cache. Panic was immediate. "Grenades! Move! Fall back!" shouted Lieutenant Petrov, his voice cracking under stress. Soldiers scrambled through trenches, narrowly avoiding flying debris, as the battlefield seemed to shrink around them, controlled by unseen hands. Artillery units attempted to coordinate a counterattack. D-30 howitzers fired rounds at suspected drone positions, while multiple batteries aimed for overlapping kill zones. The air shook as 122mm shells ripped into the treeline. Yet every impact seemed only to confirm the drone's tactical superiority. Within seconds, multiple drones reappeared, striking where the artillery had thinned the lines. The Soviets were forced into a deadly pattern. Every defensive maneuver created a new vulnerability. Every response was anticipated. Confusion and fear became palpable. Soldiers no longer knew where to fire or where to take cover. In one brutal encounter, a lone T-72 attempted to cover infantry movements across an open field. The tank's 125mm gun roared, firing heat rounds at suspected targets. A small drone suddenly darted below the turret's line of sight, releasing a compact-shaped charge. The detonation punched through the rear armor, igniting the engine. Flames shot skyward as the crew abandoned the vehicle, leaping into snow and debris. Panic swept the nearby infantry. Soldiers froze, watching comrades struggle against the inferno. Strategic shock rippled through the ranks. The battlefield rules had changed, and survival was no longer guaranteed by armor, firepower, or even numbers. Meanwhile, MiG-29 streaked across the clouded sky, engines screaming, radar locked on the tiny targets. Pilots reported bizarre readings, sudden drops in altitude, sensors flickering, electronic countermeasures disabling targeting systems. One pilot, Captain Yuri Volkov, radioed frantically. "We cannot lock on. They're jamming our systems, no visual signature. This is not conventional." Within moments, a small swarm of drones attacked a logistics convoy, detonating precisely behind the MiG's path. Bombs rained on vehicles carrying ammunition and fuel, and the convoy became a firestorm. Horror gripped every pilot and crewman as they realized the drone's impact was not just physical, it was psychological, breaking the morale of those who still hoped for conventional retaliation. On the ground, infantry attempted desperate improvisation. Squad leaders coordinated smoke screens, anti-aircraft fire, and explosive traps. Yet each attempt was met with failure. Drones navigated smoke with infrared guidance, striking with unerring accuracy. Soldiers screamed as entire squads were wiped out in seconds, grenades detonating too late, rifles useless against invisible, hovering threats. Panic spiraled into chaos. Men abandoned formations, running blindly through snow-laden craters, only to be cut down by tiny missiles detonating on impact. Strategic shock had reached its apex. There was no front line, no safe sector, and the rules of engagement were meaningless. Even the environment became an ally to the drones. Frost-laden trees collapsed under shell fire, snowbanks melted into mud, and clouds reflected laser targeting, turning natural cover into deadly traps. Soldiers realized too late that every defensive tactic could be turned against them. Tunnels designed to shelter men from artillery were struck with delayed explosives. Trenches became death traps as drones released compact munitions capable of penetrating earth and reinforced steel. Confusion was everywhere. The battlefield, once structured and predictable, had become a labyrinth of destruction and terror. Sergei Ivanov watched as the battlefield unfolded into total chaos. His T-72 crew had narrowly survived multiple drone strikes, but their morale was crumbling. "How do you fight what you cannot see, cannot hit, cannot anticipate?" muttered the gunner, his hands shaking on the fire control system. The truth was undeniable. Conventional Soviet tactics, armor, artillery, infantry coordination, were failing against an enemy that combined technology, precision, and autonomy. Fear was no longer just an emotion, it had become the controlling force of the battlefield. By midday, the Soviets had lost control of the situation entirely. Drones now struck in coordinated waves, systematically dismantling defensive positions. Supply lines were severed, tanks disabled, and infantry decimated. Even the air response had failed to regain initiative. The battlefield had become a theater of horror and confusion. Every explosion, every flame, every scream reinforced the unrelenting psychological pressure. The drones were omnipresent, intelligent, and devastatingly effective. The escalation continued, relentless and unforgiving. Tanks burned, supply convoys were obliterated, and soldiers fell victim to a weapon that defied conventional understanding. The Soviets had faced air raids, artillery barrages, and infantry assaults before, but never an enemy that could strike with surgical precision, vanish, and strike again with no warning. Fear had fully taken hold. Panic was widespread. Confusion dominated every tactical decision. And in the midst of it all, the drones hovered silently, calculating their next wave of devastation. The battle was no longer just a physical struggle. It was a war of nerves, a psychological nightmare, and a brutal lesson in the evolving rules of warfare. The Soviets were learning, in the most terrifying way possible, that the future of battle had arrived, swift, invisible, and merciless. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield resembled a frozen graveyard. Smoke spiraled into the gray sky, twisting around shattered trees and burned-out vehicles. The Soviets were battered, disoriented, and demoralized, their losses mounting with terrifying speed. Yet amid the devastation, a seed of defiance began to take root. Commanders realized that conventional tactics had failed. To survive, they would need to adapt, improvise, and fight smarter than the enemy expected. The turning point was approaching, but it would demand ingenuity, courage, and sheer audacity. Sergei Ivanov's T-72 squadron had retreated to a partially fortified ridge, using the high ground to observe drone movements. The vehicles were battered, some barely operational, yet their crews were determined. "We can't just wait to die," Sergei muttered, scanning the sky through frost-laden optics. His words carried a grim truth. To survive, they had to become proactive. Soldiers huddled in trenches, listening for the telltale whine of drone rotors. Fear still gripped them, but it now mixed with a steely resolve. Lieutenant Petrov coordinated the first real countermeasure. Using a combination of electronic warfare units scavenged from nearby depots, they began deploying jammers to disrupt drone navigation. Improvised nets and reflective panels were set up to create false targets, attempting to confuse the autonomous systems. It was an untested strategy, a gamble against a weapon designed to anticipate human tactics. The men moved with precise urgency, placing equipment between craters and snowbanks, their eyes scanning constantly for the smallest hint of movement. Panic had not vanished, but it was now tempered by focus and discipline. The first countermeasure yielded immediate results. A drone attempting a strike on an ammunition cache suddenly swerved erratically, caught in the jamming field. Explosions were avoided, and the soldiers shouted in disbelief, adrenaline surging through their veins. Encouraged, Sergei ordered his T-72s to advance in a staggered formation, using smoke screens and terrain masking to create overlapping defensive zones. The tank's 125mm cannons were now aimed not only at visible targets, but at predicted strike paths, anticipating where drones would attempt to land munitions. For the first time that day, the Soviets seized the initiative, albeit tenuously. The drones, however, adapted with frightening speed. They adjusted flight patterns, dropped payloads from unexpected angles, and began deploying decoys to bypass jammers. One T-72 nearly fell victim to a kamikaze-style attack. A small drone descended rapidly, its explosive payload timed to strike as the tank's gun traversed. Sergei's gunner reacted instinctively, firing a round that shredded the drone midair. The impact shook the tank violently, and a rush of relief swept through the crew. The momentary success was a psychological victory, proving that the drones were not invincible. Panic faltered, replaced by strategic determination. Meanwhile, infantry squads coordinated with the T-72s, moving in synchronized maneuvers designed to trap drones in overlapping fields of fire. Soldiers lobbed grenades along predicted paths, while machine guns scanned the sky with unerring focus. Fear remained, but it was now harnessed into action. "Hold your line! Fire only on predicted paths!" shouted Sergeant Dmitry Ivanovich. Coordination became the key weapon, the first glimmer of order in a battlefield previously dominated by chaos. Artillery units began to shift tactics as well. Instead of indiscriminate barrages, fire was now concentrated on probable drone corridors. Observation teams calculated strike windows, and shells were fired in rapid, controlled bursts. The precision of counter-battery fire surprised even the soldiers themselves. Several drones were shredded mid-flight, their twisted remains falling into snow and mud. Confusion began to affect the enemy. The omnipresent sense of invulnerability the drones had wielded was faltering. Strategic shock now cut both ways. Air support was recalibrated too. MiG-29 pilots experimented with unpredictable maneuvers, coordinating with ground-based jammers and flare deployments. One daring squadron lured a swarm of drones into a preset kill zone above a frozen river. Tracers lit the gray sky, explosions echoed, and for the first time, pilots reported multiple simultaneous kills. The battlefield's balance was shifting. Fear was still present, but hope, however fragile, began to pulse through the Soviet ranks. Yet the turning point was far from complete. The drones adapted again, this time deploying micromunitions capable of evading jammers. One T-72 was hit, and flames erupted across the frozen terrain. Soldiers rushed to extinguish fires, dragging comrades to safety, hearts hammering in a mix of fear and urgency. The battle had become a deadly chess game, each side anticipating the other's moves in a relentless contest of adaptation. Every tactical success was tempered by the reminder that the enemy remained deadly, intelligent, and relentless. Amid the chaos, an unexpected moment of clarity emerged. Sergei Ivanov realized that the drones, for all their precision, relied on predictable patterns, altitude, speed, and flight corridors constrained by physics. By combining terrain masking, jamming, and coordinated strikes, the Soviets could create zones where drones would be forced into vulnerability. It was an audacious plan, and the margin for error was microscopic. Fear and adrenaline sharpened focus. Hesitation would mean death. As afternoon turned to evening, the first cracks in the enemy's dominance appeared. A squadron of drones was funneled into a kill zone, where coordinated tank fire, machine guns, and artillery barrages annihilated nearly half the swarm. Survivors scattered, retreating into the night. The soldiers' faces reflected disbelief and grim satisfaction. For the first time, they had inflicted real damage on a foe that had seemed invincible. Strategic shock now shifted from fear of the unknown to recognition of possibility. The enemy could be beaten, but only with nerve, precision, and cunning. Still, the battlefield remained perilous. Fires raged across the frozen expanse, and pockets of drones continued their attacks. Every success was measured, cautious, and temporary. Panic lingered, Fear remained, and confusion threatened to undo the hard-won gains. Yet one truth had become undeniable: the tide could turn. The Soviets had discovered a vulnerability, and for the first time that day, hope pierced the haze of horror and chaos. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the battlefield, Sergei Ivanov looked across the frozen wasteland. Flames flickered in the distance, snow stained with soot and blood. Around him, his men moved with purpose, every glance scanning the skies, every finger poised on triggers. The first shock of devastation had passed. Now came the test: could the Soviets capitalize on the enemy's first signs of weakness? Or would the drones adapt again, resetting the rules of combat with terrifying efficiency? The stage was set for the coming climax. The turning point had arrived, but the final reckoning, the brutal, all-consuming battle to reclaim control, was yet to come. Fear and courage, panic and determination, destruction and ingenuity would collide in a deadly crescendo that would leave no soldier, vehicle, or defensive position unscathed. Nightfall descended over the frozen battlefield, casting long, dark shadows over craters, burning tanks, and shattered bunkers. The Soviets had weathered hours of relentless drone attacks, coordinated counterstrikes, and psychological terror, but the enemy was far from finished. The drones, adaptive and relentless, returned with renewed ferocity, launching precision strikes that threatened to obliterate any hope of a final Soviet counteroffensive. The tension was unbearable. Fear, panic, and strategic shock coalesced into a living, breathing entity on the frozen terrain. Sergei Ivanov's T-72 squadron formed a defensive arc around the remnants of a critical fuel depot. Flames licked the cold night air as the men braced for another wave. The first sign of the enemy came as faint dots glinting in the distance, hundreds of small drones converging, moving with terrifying synchronization. The hum of their rotors was a sinister chorus, amplified in the silence of the winter night. Soldiers clutched weapons, eyes wide, fingers trembling over triggers. This was the moment where training, courage, and pure instinct collided with raw technological superiority. The first salvo struck. A micro-missile zipped silently through the darkness, obliterating a nearby ammunition crate in a thunderous explosion. Shrapnel tore into the earth, throwing frozen mud into the air. Infantry soldiers ducked behind wreckage, shouting in fear and disbelief. Smoke and fire created a surreal haze. The battlefield became a theater of chaos, punctuated by staccato explosions and the screams of men. Yet the Soviets had prepared. Electronic jammers emitted sharp pulses, interfering with drone sensors. Reflective panels and nets created false targets, causing several drones to miscalculate strike trajectories. T-72 cannons roared, firing high-explosive rounds at predicted flight paths. One drone collided with the explosive airburst, twisting and falling into a burning crater. Cheers and shouts briefly erupted among the soldiers, a fleeting triumph against an otherwise invisible enemy. The drones responded with shocking ingenuity. Small kamikaze units descended directly toward tanks, splitting formations, while others released micro-munitions designed to penetrate armor. The sky above became a deadly dance of motion, light, and destruction. Flames enveloped AT-72 as a missile struck its side armor. Crewmen scrambled, extinguishing fires while returning fire. Panic and fear surged, but so did determination. This was no longer a defensive struggle. It was a fight for survival, a test of every soldier's skill and nerve. Infantry squads launched daring counterattacks. Private Anatoly and his unit surged across an exposed field, tossing grenades toward drone landing zones. Machine guns ripped the air, their tracers illuminating the night with streaks of orange and red. One grenade detonated precisely under a hovering drone, shredding its frame. Fear and adrenaline intertwined as men realized that courage could create opportunities even against overwhelming odds. Above, MiG-29 streaked through freezing clouds, engines screaming, flares trailing in their wake. Pilots coordinated with ground teams, forming baited traps. Drones that had once seemed invincible now faced concentrated, multi-layered strikes. Captain Yuri Volkov maneuvered a MiG in a high-speed dive, luring a swarm into a kill corridor prepared by artillery and tank fire. The sky erupted in fire and smoke. Twisted metal rained down. Strategic shock rippled through the ranks. Fear was now matched by awe at the destructive precision that humans could still exert against the autonomous menace. The battle escalated further as drones launched an unprecedented countermeasure. Synchronized salvo attacks aimed simultaneously at tanks, artillery, and infantry. Explosions rocked the ridge, sending men sprawling. A T-72 turret was ripped off by a well-placed strike, flames engulfing the crew compartment. Soldiers dragged survivors into cover, screaming orders over the din. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Fear, panic, and horror had reached their zenith. Yet, for every drone destroyed, the Soviets learned, adapted, and retaliated. Sergei Ivanov's squad deployed decoy targets and feigned retreats to lure drones into concentrated fire zones. A second wave of MiGs arrived, using infrared flares to blind targeting systems, while artillery barrages synchronized with ground assaults. The first truly coordinated, multidimensional counterstrike of the day began. The turning tide was dramatic. Drones began falling in larger numbers, their flight patterns disrupted by jammers and explosive traps. T-72 cannons found targets previously thought untouchable. Infantry squads, emboldened by small successes, pressed forward with calculated aggression. One squadron flanked a tree line where drones had been nesting, lobbing grenades and improvised charges into hiding zones. Smoke and fire enveloped the enemy, creating confusion for a system that relied on calculation and precision. Despite their advantage, the drones had not been defeated. For every loss inflicted, two more appeared, descending in unpredictable patterns. Micromunitions exploded against tanks, grenades detonated too late, and infantry units suffered losses. Fear and panic returned with each wave, but now, unlike before, they were tempered by resolve and experience. The Soviets were learning the rhythm of the enemy, anticipating maneuvers, and exploiting vulnerabilities. In one of the most harrowing moments, a small platoon was pinned between two drone swarms. Flames leapt from an exploding fuel depot nearby, smoke choking the air. Sergeant Dmitry Ivanovich barked orders. "Cover fire! Fall back in zigzags! Don't stop moving!" Soldiers obeyed with a mix of terror and discipline, ducking behind rubble, firing at shadows. A drone struck one tank, but another was ready with overlapping fire, obliterating the threat before it could reach infantry. The climax reached its peak as the battlefield became a chaotic symphony of explosions, tracer fire, and mechanical whines. Tanks roared, artillery boomed, and drones screamed through the night, their small frames lighting up with destructive payloads. Soldiers' faces were streaked with soot and sweat, eyes wide with horror and determination. Every movement was life or death. Every decision could mean survival, or instant annihilation. By midnight, the Soviets had begun to regain limited control. Waves of drones had been destroyed, flight paths disrupted, and the surviving enemy forces scattered into the night. Tanks remained operational, artillery still fired, and infantry held key positions. The cost had been immense: vehicles destroyed, comrades lost, and psychological scars etched deep, but the climax of the battle had ended. As Sergei Ivanov surveyed the battlefield, blackened and smoldering under a starless sky, he realized the magnitude of what had transpired. Fear and panic had been relentless, yet courage, coordination, and adaptability had turned the tide. Strategic shock had transformed into hard-earned victory. The drones had not been invincible; they had been challenged, resisted, and beaten, at least for now. The battlefield fell silent except for the occasional crackle of fire and distant groans of the wounded. Soldiers slumped into the snow, exhausted but alive. Their faces reflected the unspoken truth: they had survived the impossible, faced an invisible, adaptive enemy, and emerged, bloodied but resolute. But even in victory, one thought lingered in every mind: what would the enemy strike with next? The battlefield was eerily quiet at dawn. Smoke still curled from burning tanks, shattered bunkers, and ruined supply depots, a ghostly haze that mingled with the frozen morning mist. The snow was scarred with craters, streaked with mud, soot, and the dark stains of blood. Survivors stumbled through the wreckage, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. The once proud forward base had been transformed into a frozen graveyard overnight, a testament to the destructive power of the enemy drones. Sergei Ivanov emerged from the remnants of his T-72, surveying the aftermath. His crew was battered but alive. Around him, men moved in silence, some carrying wounded comrades, others dragging bodies from wrecked trenches. The cries of the injured were sharp and haunting against the cold wind. Panic had ebbed, replaced by a hollow, numbing fatigue. Strategic shock lingered in the air, palpable and suffocating. Reports were trickling in from other units. Entire platoons had been wiped out. Artillery positions were destroyed or abandoned, supply lines severed. The drones had inflicted catastrophic losses, yet somehow, through sheer determination and adaptation, the Soviets had survived. Even so, survival came at a staggering cost. Fear and horror were etched into every face. Men whispered quietly, recounting moments of impossible odds, narrow escapes, and comrades lost in seconds. The battlefield had become a crucible of human endurance. Lieutenant Mikhail Petrov huddled with his squad, examining maps and makeshift reports. The night's engagement had revealed new truths. Conventional tactics were no longer sufficient. Armor, artillery, and infantry alone could not repel autonomous threats. Every tactic had to be rethought, every movement calculated. The drones had shattered assumptions, forcing the Soviets to confront a terrifying reality. The future of war had arrived, fast, silent, and merciless. Despite the devastation, there were glimmers of hope. Sergei's squad had inflicted significant damage on the enemy, destroying dozens of drones and disrupting coordinated strikes. Tanks remained operational, artillery was ready to fire if needed, and surviving infantry had learned to anticipate attacks and use the terrain strategically. Fear had been converted, however briefly, into experience. The soldiers had endured the impossible and adapted in real time. But the victory was hollow, tainted by loss. In one particularly haunting scene, Private Anatoly stood over the snow-strewn bodies of his comrades, tears freezing on his cheeks. He had survived multiple drone strikes by mere seconds, but the screams and chaos of the night lingered in his mind. Every explosion, every flash of light, every mechanical whine of drones haunted him. Around him, soldiers moved like ghosts, their movements slow, deliberate, weighed down by the psychological weight of what they had endured. Fear had left an indelible mark, more lasting than any physical injury. The drones themselves had vanished with the night, leaving silence in their wake. Yet their presence remained in the minds of every survivor. They had been efficient, adaptive, and utterly terrifying, a weapon that redefined combat. Commanders now faced a sobering assessment: even victory had not restored security. The battlefield had changed. Traditional doctrine was obsolete. Every soldier, every commander, understood that next time, the enemy might strike harder, smarter, and with even greater lethality. Sergei Ivanov walked among the wreckage, noting burned-out T-72s, twisted artillery, and scattered munitions. The night's ordeal had transformed men and machines alike. Tanks that once symbolized invincibility had been brought low by tiny, autonomous killers. Infantry who had trained for coordinated assaults now understood the limits of human anticipation. The entire landscape of war had been challenged, and survival had demanded ingenuity, courage, and raw instinct. Yet as the survivors began clearing wreckage and regrouping, a final shock awaited. On the horizon, faint blinking lights appeared, smaller than before, but unmistakably drones. They moved with calculated precision, hovering over the tree line and scanning for survivors. Panic surged anew. The soldiers had endured a nightmare, yet its specter returned. The enemy had adapted, evolved, and was ready for the next strike. Strategic shock hit like a physical blow. Survival did not mean safety, it meant readiness for horrors yet to come. Sergei's voice rang out across the ridge. "Prepare for movement! Don't underestimate them! This is far from over!" His words were tinged with determination, yet even he felt the icy grip of fear. Men scrambled to ready tanks, check weapons, and fortify positions. The night's victory had taught them that courage and strategy could hold back the enemy, but only temporarily. The drones were patient, relentless, and intelligent. Every lesson learned might soon be tested again. As the sun climbed over the snow-streaked battlefield, smoke mingling with early morning mist, soldiers paused to take stock. Bodies were counted, wounded tended to, and survivors gathered in small, exhausted groups. Every face told the same story: fear, horror, and disbelief, tempered by the will to survive. For some, victory was hollow. For others, it was a testament to human resilience. Yet none could deny a chilling truth: the age of conventional warfare was over, replaced by a new, terrifying reality where invisible, adaptive enemies dictated the rules of survival. In the final moments, as the soldiers regrouped and prepared to march to the next defensive position, the horizon remained ominous. Drone shadows flickered in the distance, evidence that the enemy was far from finished. The survivors carried the psychological weight of the night's destruction, an unshakable fear, the scars of panic, and the memory of a battlefield where machines and men collided in a deadly dance. The final shock lingered, survival was temporary, and the next strike could come at any moment, silent, deadly, and utterly merciless. The battlefield, once quiet, now whispered a haunting truth: humanity had endured, but in the age of autonomous weapons, the line between fear, panic, and survival had been irrevocably blurred. The Soviets had survived the impossible, but the war itself had changed forever.